Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/16 scale radio-controlled mid-production German Tiger 1. Now the model that we have here is built for private commission and belongs to a private collector. Like I often mention in these videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35 scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. Now, this model here has undergone quite a bit of modification as well as reworking compared to what the stock original model and kit offered. We'll be going over all of these additions, modifications, and even taking the tank for a test drive throughout the entire length of the series on this build. Now, while on that subject, this build here is going to be very similar to many of the other 1/16 scale builds that are showcased on the ECA channel, where I take the video and it's divided into 3 segments. This is done primarily because of time restraints. Now, in this video, we're going to go ahead and discuss the model's background as well as the condition the starter model was in when it arrived in the shop. This build did receive an extensive amount of repair work as well as mechanical, electrical, and detail mods and changes that need to have been made. So strap yourselves in because there's going to be a lot of content coming at you. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is the mid-production variant of the German Tiger 1 heavy tank. What we now refer to as the mid-production Tiger was really a transitional type vehicle where the Germans were trying to refine the Tiger's design as well as making it easier for mass production, use less materials to produce, and also simplifying the design, getting rid of a lot of features which were originally designed into this vehicle but were really unneeded and were deemed unnecessary once the vehicles began being fielded and seen in combat. As many of us know, the Tiger 1 was originally designed back in 1942. The original Tiger 1's design had a lot of interesting capabilities to it, one of which was the ability to ford and wade through rivers in order to get to the opposite side in case the bridges were bombed out, or if the bridges were not capable of holding up the sheer weight of a vehicle as heavy as the Tiger 1. These vehicles would have originally been equipped with the HL210 engine, and shortly after these vehicles began being fielded, some extra modifications and adjustments to the design were being added, such as the addition of a rear bustle bin, side skirts, and also a pre-air filter system that would be mounted on the exterior of the vehicle, which would pre-screen the air prior to it entering into the engine compartment and into the engine. Well, about a year later into the Tiger 1's production run, feedback came in from the field that the vehicle can be enhanced even further, and some of these interesting features were just not going to be required or necessary. One of the very first features that was dropped on the Tiger 1's production line in order to speed up production was the ability for the tank to wade and ford through rivers. This was a feature that, although it was a very interesting concept, once in production and being fielded, wasn't one that was really being used or deemed that necessary. So by dropping this feature, this did change the vehicle's design quite a bit. Some of the changes that was made was that first, a lot of the watertight features and capabilities that were built into the vehicle's engine compartment as well as the engine hatch were no longer necessary. This saved on the amount of resources being used to build each and every one of these vehicles, and also definitely cut down on the complexity. Also removed was the ability for the vehicle to have a telescoping snorkel which would thread onto a large fitting found on the rear section of the rear deck. In addition to that, the vehicle's air intake was also changed, as on the original design, the air intake was designed to thread and seal up onto the engine deck, thus giving it its watertight capability. Once this was no longer required, the large air intake was basically bolted and welded in place in the open position. Again, this is done to streamline production. Some other external fittings were also changed. For instance, the FIFO air filtration system was no longer necessary and was replaced. Automotively, the vehicles at this point here were no longer utilizing the HL210, which was originally found on the initial production and on some of the early production units, and on vehicles from this production batch, the Tiger was completely switched over for the use of the HL230 gas engine. Some other fittings like the large external toolbox was also replaced, and many of the external fittings found on the top deck were changed and rearranged as well, namely the basic tool configuration found on the front portion of the upper deck. Some other changes that were also added was the replacement of the two bow headlights, which were found on either side of the front hull, and this was replaced with a single Bosch light located in the center of the front armored plate. On the turret, a new low-profile commander's cupola was designed, which greatly reduced the vehicle's overall height and giving the tank commander a little bit more protection compared to the early style drum cupola found on the previous generations. While on that section, the Germans also rearranged the turret roof layout, where the original air filter was moved to the center of the turret, and in many cases the original large pistol port was removed as well. On some renditions of this vehicle, there is absolutely no pistol port whatsoever, but others, a smaller plug pistol port was later developed on vehicles that came towards the end of the mid-production run. Other changes that were also developed would include the changing of the side hull track removal cable. On the mid-production units, the layout was changed, which utilized less materials and was also the exact same design which was being utilized on the King Tiger, giving the vehicle some more common parts compatibility. Some other changes would also include a redesign of the vehicle's sprocket and the track. The sprocket outer hub was redesigned, making it a little bit more easier to machine compared to the earlier units, and also the track was changed by altering the castings for the links, where on the mid-production units you would have an ice cleat type layout. This track design and sprocket design would continue onto the vehicles which came afterwards, which utilized the steel wheel, or what we would know as the late production Tigers. Now for the vehicle's running gear, the original design rubber-rimmed dish pattern road wheels were still utilized on many of the mid-production Tiger units. What's interesting, however, to point out is, like I mentioned before, the mid-production tank was a transitional phase type vehicle, in that you will see vehicles from the mid-production era that have both the early pattern road wheels as well as the large pattern rear idler wheel, but you will also see vehicles that utilize the next generation steel rimmed road wheels and the smaller diameter rear idler wheel, which again are more common features on late production units or vehicles that were manufactured towards the latter half of the war. What's actually really unique about the mid-production vehicles is that you had a large number of vehicles that were built in this configuration from the get-go, fresh from the factory. However, there were also a number of vehicles which were rebuilt to the condition that you see it here. These would have been vehicles which would have been produced earlier on, such as initial or early production tanks that were either battle damaged or were at this point probably worn out and were sent back to the factory for a rebuild process. Much similar to what we see today with like the US Army updating and upgrading the old M1 hulls that are lying around. Now occasionally you might come across something like this if you're doing research on the Tiger 1. In many cases you'll stumble across photographs of what are, for all intents and purposes, mid-production vehicles, but feature a mix of late and early production fittings. Such examples would be a vehicle that has, say, a early production drum cupola, but with the center-mounted air filter. On the hull, you might run a mix of vehicles that have the early pattern sprocket, but steel wheels, or the rubber pattern of road wheels combined with the late pattern of small idler wheel. And it's really these weird oddities that does allow the builder to have a little bit of fun and a little bit of variety when modeling the Tiger 1. Well, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a step back to when the model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the model's condition was at the start of the build. And here's the model at the start of the project. The model being used for the donor is this 1/16 scale full option radio control Tiger 1 from Tamiya. The model was pre-assembled by another builder, and the model was sent to me in the configuration that we see here in order for me to convert it to the completed model that was just showcased. The Tamiya full option 1/16 scale early production Tiger 1 kit is very noteworthy in that this was the first new tooling 1/16 scale tank model kit that Tamiya has made in many decades up at this point. Prior to the release of this kit here, Tamiya's 1/16 scale kit lineup consisted of the Gepard, the Leopard 1 A4, the King Tiger with the Henschel production turret, a Porsche King Tiger, as well as the 105mm Sherman. All of these kits that I just mentioned have their tooling dating back to the late 1970s and early 1980s. During this time period of the 1990s, there was a real doldrum and void in the 1/16 scale tank hobby, and it really didn't even exist. At this time, the Sherman was made of unobtainium, the King Tiger was floating around, as was the Leopard 1A4. The Gepard, along with the Sherman, were very few and far between to find, and the Henschel, I should say the King Tiger with the Porsche turret, was very commonly available, but was exclusively sold in a static format, to Tamiya's infinite wisdom at the time. As the doldrum of the 90s came to an end, Tamiya unveiled this particular kit here, the early production full option kit. This tank here was unique in that it offered a brand new bit of tooling that had at the time current state-of-the-art type quality and detailing, and it was also the first Tamiya kit to utilize the full option system. Prior to this, the tank, namely the Gepard or the King Tiger, did feature a clutch type system for drive and a very rudimentary turret rotation system and a gun flash simulator. In the late 1990s, the M4 Sherman made its reappearance and was the first tank to be equipped with the electronic DMD system, which replaced the old style clutch. The DMD is still used on all of the Tamiya full option tank kits up until today, but this Tiger one here was the first to incorporate the full option chipboard, which the DMD connects into. Another noteworthy point to mention is that even though these kits were very popular when first released, one problem that they had, and arguably still have to this day, has to do with the price that these kits were offered at. The Tamiya full option kits, specifically this Tiger one here, retailed for about $700 to $1,100 US, which even today is still a bit of change and is one of the biggest critiques on these Tamiya full option RC tank kits. However, there was still so much demand for a affordable 1/16 scale radio control tank that a Chinese company by the name of Henlong decided to take this particular kit here, as well as the M26 Pershing, and simplify them and reduce them to a price point where they can have the basic overall detailing, a little watered down performance, but offer it onto the market for a price tag of about $60 to $70 US. Those were, needless to say, a complete and utter hit, and rejuvenated the 1/16 scale tank market to the way it is flourishing today. Now, like I said before, this particular kit here was pre-assembled by another builder, and by judging on the patina and rust on the old antenna here, the kit was built at least minimum of about a decade ago. Now, the person who did build this tank built it primarily out of box, and I'm not seeing any sort of issues with the drivetrain or the gearbox for that matter. The builder swapped out the stock plastic track with a set of metal die-cast track links, which are the Tamiya pattern. If we notice, they have the open hinge sections on the inner portion of the track hinges. And the builder also went ahead and applied a coat of Zemerit to this model that we have here. The application of the Zemrit is actually very nicely done. It's crisp and rough in the areas where one would expect for Zemrit. And also the tank's overall paint job is actually acceptable. It's got a nice subdued dual tone, German World War II type crisp pattern. And even though it is fairly dusty, I'm pretty sure that when new, the tank probably looked pretty good. For the model's markings, the individual went ahead and applied them with a stencil. It's not a decal, which is actually a very nice feature, and is actually one that I do on my 1/6 scale builds, and also on a few of my 1/16 scale builds that I've done in the past. Now, the model was sent to me in the exact same configuration that you see here. It did not ship with a radio, as the builder is going to be sending me a new radio to swap in and replace the old unit that we have here. Now, when the unit was arrived, it did suffer some shipping damage that I can see. The biggest amount of damage that was occurred has to do with this section that we have here. Obviously, that is something that is definitely something to point out, and is something that is going to be addressed and fixed by yours truly. At some point during the transit, the model must have taken some kind of an impact, and the corner here was completely shattered. Now, I looked in the box and I was unable to find any of the remnants remaining, so this area here is going to have to be rebuilt and blended in with scratch building methods. The front plate also has some damage to it from the glue seams, and the entire upper deck fits on very, very loose, and again, some hand fitting and hand readjusting is going to be required in order to alleviate that. And I just popped off the headlight just now, which definitely signifies old glues. Back to the tank's Zemrit coating. It appears that whoever built this tank originally wanted to Zemrit this plate over here, but at some point decided to change his mind and attempted to sand it all off. This piece here will have a new coat of Zemrit paste added, as this front portion here of the Tiger One nose did have a coat of Zemrit. Same can also be said to the rear wall here of the vehicle. The builder did not add the Zemrit coating to this section, and this rear wall section would of course have this Zemrit coating added as well. Now, of course, since this tank is going to be converted into a mid-production Tiger One, many of the details are going to change, most notably the removal of the FIFO system, as well as a few of the other small odds and end bits, which of course I'll be going over as the video progresses. Now, with the exterior out of the way, you know what time it is.
It popped the hood.
Pop the hood?
Pop the hood.
And to do that, I'll simply just grab the turret and lift straight up. The top deck lifts right off of the model. All of the internal connections are still connected. I'm going to have to unplug all these during the tank's reconstruction phase. I will say that the upper hull sits on in a very loose manner, and this is going to have to be addressed during the build. More likely this happened from the damage that occurred on the rear corner here, shifting some of the hull plates. Again, this is going to have to be addressed once the build actually goes into full swing. Now, under the hood, the model is again stock Tamiya. As you can see, there's still some shipping peanuts left on the inside that, of course, we have to siphon through. The gearbox is stock, as are all of the electronics. The tank does have its batteries supplied. However, I'm going to test these out just to make sure that they're good. If not, they're going to be jettisoned and replaced with a new fresh pack. The tank also has an old school type antenna. I should say an old school radio. Yeah, this wire's in my way, but the radio that the tank has is, of course, the older pattern with the external antenna, like I mentioned, and this will be replaced with a brand new 2.4 gigahertz Futaba unit that will be dropped in, replacing the need for this really obnoxious aerial antenna, which will make the build go by a lot easier. Also, I will then be able to replace this large hole that we have here on the upper hull with a nice detail German AFE antenna base unit. Now, moving our way to the turret. The turret's rotation is very, very loose. That is another thing I'm going to have to address. And here we have the turret's interior. This is the gun elevation system as well as the recoil system. There is, of course, the photostrobe flash. Now, I do not see present on this model here the tank fighting infrared system, which was present on several of the other Tamiya commission builds that I've done in the past. This model doesn't appear to have that system mounted, and is basically, I think, going to be just a standard traditional build. Whoever built this tank did put the main power switch here on the turret. This may or may not change as the build goes on, but of course more information on that is to follow. And here's the model now just about ready for painting, so let's go ahead and go over it before I take it to the next step. First, let's start with the suspension. Now, I'm not going to go over everything thoroughly because this is going to be discussed in more depth in the next video update, namely the modifications that was made here to the front wheel. But you'll notice that the entire lower hull, as well as the suspension, are pre-painted at this point here. Just like I frequently mention in these videos, when it comes to tanks in general, but specifically true on the Tiger, you want to pre-paint everything prior to the assembly of the wheels, because trying to get paint into all these little areas and between the wheels and even behind the wheels, as you can imagine, is going to be basically impossible. So all of this work and even the weathering work is done beforehand. Then once this is all set, the suspension gets refitted to the vehicle, and then everything gets maxed up so that the rest of the model can go into paint. Now, getting back to this corner over here, like what was showcased earlier, on this section the model did have some damage, and this entire section was missing and was cracked off. You can see now that the piece is basically indistinguishable from now the rest of the model with the repair work that was done. Luckily, because that this tank does have the coat of Zemerit mounted on it, blending in this little repaired section here was fairly easily done. While on the opposite side of the vehicle, here we have the track removal cable mounts. Now, these were fabricated, and touching upon it briefly, the kit does supply you with this part, but it's a pattern for an early production Tiger 1. Being a mid-production vehicle, the cable layout would have been in the configuration that we have here, which is the same that's on the late production Tiger. But more information on this is also to come in part 2 of this video set. Now, moving up to the top deck, a lot of fittings and changes have been made to this vehicle in order to better replicate a mid-production vehicle from its original early production skies. And of course, yeah, as you guessed it, more information on that is to be discussed in part 2, but while here you can see the engine hatch. Now, one nice feature about these Tamiya kits is that the engine hatch is fully functional, and if I move it, this gets you for the access on the battery charging system. Now, on this model here, it has something extra. First, you'll notice I have a little pack of AA batteries, and you can also see a small little switch in this section over here. This is to power the bow headlight found on this model. Now, from what I've seen, there is a way to patch in the headlight to the Tamiya electronics. However, it was recommended to me not to go with that route for one reason or another, so I went with a separate battery source. It's just a simple little hookup, 2 AA batteries in this little hookup that we have here. Hit the switch, and the bow headlight turns on, but you'll definitely see more of that in part 3 of this series. Here we have the battery recharge jack, which is quite customary on all of my builds. Now, one thing that's unique about this rendition of the Tiger 1 is that unlike the other Tamiya Tiger 1 that I recently completed, where it uses 2 7.2 batteries, this model here only utilizes 1, and that's because of the amperage that the battery is on this vehicle. It was again relayed to me on good authority that one single high amp hour battery is really all that's required to power one of these Tiger 1s, and you'll see that once I pop the top off to show the interior. And before I go ahead and take the top off, let's go ahead and look at the turret. Here you can see the deletion of the pistol port, which is found in this section here. This wouldn't have been present on a mid-production vehicle, as the Germans themselves were phasing that little bit of equipment out for this production run. Some spare track racks have been fitted to the turret. These are temporarily just held in place. They're going to be removed and going to be mounted permanently once the model goes into paint. But you guessed it, more information on that is to come. And here on the turret roof, you can see some other modifications that have been made in order to better replicate a tank that is from the mid-production batch. The cupola was swapped out with that metal one that I mentioned earlier, only you'll notice it's a lot shorter compared to the original kit supplied counterpart. Ventilator has been mounted in the center, but you'll notice on this vehicle here, there's no close-in quarter defense weapon. This is as per the vehicle that I was researching that this model here is going to better replicate. A gunner scope was mounted over here on the roof, but you'll notice that unlike the other late production vehicles that are found on the channel, it's missing the anti-aircraft armor, which was a layer of steel plate which was added to the turret roof to better give it protection from air attack. That is not going to be found on this vehicle here. Now from the engine hatch, brings us to the bow hatch. Just like with the last Tiger 1 Tamiya kit that I did, this is your location for the power switch. It's held on with just a few magnets, and this gives you access to the power switch right below. When the vehicle is powered on or powered off, you just simply take the hatch, and it should automatically index and lock into the location that you see here. And here's the model with the top removed. Now, under the hood, everything is still left 100% stock with the Tamiya kit. One addition that has been added was the 2.4 gigahertz radio. And you can see how the main power switch was relocated to the front section here directly under the hatch that I just showcased. Here we have the single 7.2 battery. Now, like I said before, when these Tamiya kits first came out, they would have originally utilized two 7.2 batteries to power the main tank's drive and also to power all the other animations. Well, from what I was told was that during the time that this tank was developed, keep in mind it's the late 1990s, early 2000, the batteries did not have the milliamps that are found on batteries that are manufactured today. So because of that, the engineers at Tamiya decided to dual up the batteries in order to power everything that you see here. The model was then reconfigured to run off of a single 7.2 battery, and with the milliamp average on this one here, it's more than enough for the functions at hand. Now, as at this point, I want to give a shout out to a fellow who really knows his stuff about these 1/16 scale RC Tamiyas, and he actually can help contribute to the wiring and DMD setup on this model. When I first got the model, I had everything working, but for some reason, the batteries weren't working anymore. So finally, after some tinkering, the customer and I decided to send it to this guy. He went ahead, inspected the model over, reduced the battery, hooked up the electronics to feed from the single system, and filled me in on what the issues were. Basically, what it came down to was one of the recharge jacks that I fabricated must have been faulty. One reason or another, to this day, it eludes me, but that system was faulty, and that was causing the disconnect with the RC function. So, with that system amputated, the model reduced to a single battery, the model is now back to full operational status. And by the way, again, I want to give a shout out to him. His contact email address is listed below. This guy really knows what he's talking about. So if you're having any problems with these Tamiya 1/16 scale RC tanks, give him a message. He'll definitely be able to help you out and get you back on your feet again. Now for the battery type that was used, here is the other battery which was removed from this system, which is a Venom 5000 milliamp hour battery, and these batteries here are really high quality and are definitely recommended for use on not just these Tamiyas, but also on even the Henlong or the Tegan builds. If you really want to get some more performance out of your models, definitely look into getting a set of these. Now, although the interior is mostly stock Tamiya, I did have to make a modification to the turret rotation system. Now, on the Tamiya model, there is a interrupter gear found on the turret rotation system so you don't break the gearbox if you hit some kind of an obstacle, which is a decent feature and is one that the other ready-to-run models does have. But on the Tamiya, it kind of has an issue with it. Let me go ahead and bring the camera closer so you get to see what I'm talking about. Okay, with this camera angle, you get to see the turret rotation system in better view. Now, over here we have the gear, which is connected to the motor gearbox, and then this little small pinion gear up here is what actually rotates the turret. Now, on the inside of the turret, there's this geared ring, and this is what makes contact with this section, thus giving you your turret rotation. Now, even though it may look like a solid piece from up here, but this gear is actually comprised of two pieces. We have the outer gear, which is again what's connecting to the gearbox, but on the inside, it kind of looks like a bathtub where we have this little spring piece of plastic that's connected to the smaller gear. The way this works is that you have some notches that are molded into the bottom gear and corresponding notches molded into this little spring piece. So when the when everything is good to go, the notches lock into the recesses on the outer gear, and the whole thing moves in unison, giving you turret rotation. But what happens more often than not is the spring piece is not exactly that strong with how it exerts force up on the ring, and so what eventually happens is that the piece loosens and you're just going to get stripping instead of the turret rotating, because this is the path of least resistance. Now, this is something I tend to see on more high mileage Tamiya models, but it's not uncommon to run into them on just even a freshly out of the box build. Now, I can't really speak for the newer generation of Tamiya kits, as I've yet to really work on any of those, but for the ones with this type of a system, this is something to watch out for. But luckily, if it happens to you, not all is lost, and it can be remedied, and I'm going to show you how in a second. Now, the trick is actually extremely simple to do. What I like to do is, with a bottle of super glue, I go ahead and I pour it into the recesses in between the gears. Now, you have to be very careful with this, because obviously you don't want to get super glue gumming up the works of the gear pinions. So you want to use a nice fresh bottle with a nice precise tip on it so that the glue only flows in where you want it. Now, I use slow drying for this, and perhaps that's probably the best way to go, because when you input the glue into the section, to the recess, you want to start rotating the gear so that you ensure that a thorough amount of glue spreads evenly along all the recesses, locking it in place. Now, essentially what you're doing is you're seizing the gear, making it one instead of two pieces. Now, the benefit is that all of the force now is being exerted on the gear that goes into the turret, and the turret will rotate in a nice, efficient manner. The downside is you are losing the capability of the interrupter gear that it had built in. So you have to be very careful and mindful of this when you're operating your model. You're not going to be able to just rotate the turret as you would have before. This also includes mounting the turret back to the tank. Now let me go ahead and take the camera back so you get to see how the turret rotates on this model. Alright, now I'm going to put the turret back on its locking points, like this. Now normally you could just twist the turret and you can hear a bunch of snaps and the turret is back where it needs to be. Basically like that. Now, you'll notice that the piece still does have some interrupting capabilities to it, but it's a lot stiffer than before. And you really want to keep this to a minimum, because what you're eventually going to do is you're just going to wear out the glue that you just put in, and basically you just have to do the same procedure over again. So it's not necessarily a permanent issue, but you want to really do that, again, minimum if at best. Which is actually good, because if there's an emergency and have to get access to the inside, you can still rotate the turret without really causing any permanent damage. So let me turn on the tank. Okay, now that the sound system's fired up, let's rotate the turret. And as you can see, the turret rotates as way it's intended. It's nice and slow, but it's nice and strong, and you're not going to have any slippage. If the turret was slipping, basically you would hear the turret rotations motor as well as the sound system, but the turret would be like wiggling like this, like dit, 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 dit. And when you hear that audible noise, you instantly know what you have. Again, it's a very simple thing to fix, but it's one that one needs to watch out for, specifically if they're working on one of these Tamiyas. From here, let's go ahead and talk about the tracks now. Now, before I mention the tracks, let me go ahead and point out the sprocket. Now, if you have a keen observant eye, you'll notice that this is not the stock sprocket hubcap. The original Tamiya model does give you a very nice detailed hubcap. However, that is for an early rendition Tiger 1, and that would not be necessarily appropriate for this type of Tiger, which is a mid-production unit. Now, in order to update or transform the early sprocket to the later sprocket, all I had to do was change the hubcap. Now, this hubcap that we have here is from the Tegan late production Tiger 1, and it was just a piece I had in my spare bin. On my late production Tiger 1 builds, the Tegan model supplies you with a set of plastic sprockets and track, and during that rebuild, I went ahead and replaced those with the metal die-cast ones. Well, because of that, I had a loose set of sprockets on hand, and their hubcaps were just popped off and used for this build. Now, the hubcaps are a drop-in replacement. No mods of any sort are needed to be made to either the hubcap or the sprocket itself. I do want to point out, though, that in order to affix the hubcap to the sprocket, I utilize clear silicone for this procedure. Just like I frequently mention on all these 1/16 RC builds, I use silicone for this because it does give you a semi-permanent bond where it stays secured to the tank and never has the risk of it popping off on you, but it's a temporary bond in that if I ever, for whatever reason, need to get access to the gearbox or you have to remove the sprocket, this hubcap here can easily be popped off with a screwdriver, and it'll cause absolutely no permanent damage to either the sprocket or the hubcap in itself. And this now brings us to the track. Now, the track on this model here was actually upgraded with a set of aftermarket track, and this track here is made from die-cast metal. The track is an early pattern track, and by and large, it's decently rendered. It's primarily just a metal copy of the original plastic track which came with these kits. Now, I also want to point out that these tracks here are actually quite dated and are not going to be utilized for this build, really for two reasons. The first reason is, if you'll notice, the detail on the interior section are really, this is what I'm referring to when I say that the tracks are dated compared to what's on the market today. If you notice, the guide horns are just solid, there's no little mud slit in them. But more importantly, if you notice on the inside portion of the hinge here, it's the Tamiya pattern where you have that exposed locking hinge rod that is visible. This is done by Tamiya just for ease of molding, and that's why on their Tiger 1 and their King Tiger, they go with this type of format. But realistically, it kind of hurts the look of the build. Notice that it does have some rough injection pins on here. Now, the injection pins aren't an issue. These just be buffed down with a file or a Dremel if I was going to utilize this track. But, like I said before, these tracks here are not going to be used. In place, I'm going to be utilizing a brand new set of late production Tiger 1 tracks from Tegan. Let me go ahead and take them out of the bag so you get to see exactly why. Now, the first reason why I opted to go with this track is for the face pattern. You'll notice that the Tegan one is the late production version that has the ice cleats found here on the top. This, again, would be more appropriate for this type of mid-production Tiger 1. If I put the two tracks side by side, you can see exactly the difference between the late and the early pattern of track. Another benefit that the Tegan links have over the other version are with the interior sections. You'll notice that the Tegan tracks are much more improved compared to the older counterpart that I just showcased. The tracks do have their mud slits in them. And in addition to the mud slits, the hinge is a solid through and through hinge, which gives you much better accuracy and detail fidelity compared to the other, albeit functional track, but slightly soft on the detailing end. Here you can see the two tracks side by side so you get an idea. Now, I know exactly what you're asking me, and that's, well, John, that's nice and dandy, but does the Tegan track time and mesh with the Tamiya sprocket? And the answer is, why, yes. Yes, it does. Here you can see that the track has absolutely no issues whatsoever timing with the tooth pattern on the Tamiya sprocket. Now, this is actually really good news because with this, you can upgrade your Tamiya tanks with these Tegan tracks. The Tegan tracks are really easy to come by, and if you encounter a Tamiya that either has a set of tracks that are worn out, or they're missing, or you just want to upgrade the tracks further from the kit offering, you don't have to splurge on a really pricey boutique company aftermarket track, and you can just roll with the Tegan ones. Keep in mind the Tegan tracks come in two flavors. You have the late production track, like for this rebuild and upgrade here, but you also have the choice of the early pattern track, which can be used on the stock Tamiya kit. Now, I'm going to go off on a limb here, but I believe that the Tegan sprockets will also be able to mount to the Tamiya spindle. I'm not sure if any mods might need to be made to the sprocket itself, be it you have to enlarge the center fastener hole, but I have a good hunch that I think that might work, which is also good news in case you encounter a Tiger 1 from Tamiya that has a busted sprocket. Inquiring one originally from Tamiya might be a little bit on the costly end, and probably might be a bit of an endeavor if you could even track it down. But these die-cast metal sprockets from Tegan are very easily come by and are had at really good prices. So that might be something to look forward to in case you encounter something like a Tamiya Tiger 1 sand sprockets in the wild. And on the topic of the tracks, here we have the tracks going through their paint thinner bath. Now, this is specifically true for these Tegan metal tracks, but on the Tegan tracks, there seems to be a thin little film of oil found on both of the track sections. This is more than likely done at the factory to help with the track's construction, as well as it does help keep them nice and fresh in their parts bag. Another benefit that the oil does have is that it makes the tracks nice and lubricated so that it prevents any sticking points on the links, and it does help them break in. However, one downside that this oil does have is it may interfere with the painting process. Keep in mind, on all of my builds, I repaint the stock tracks, or these aftermarket metal tracks, to the way you see them on the completed portion of the model. Now, in order to wash the oil off, it's a very simple procedure. All you need is a bucket, the tracks, and some paint thinner. The tracks just sit in the paint thinner for a little time. Occasionally you can go ahead and swirl and swish them around, kind of like you're painting for gold. And after 20 minutes or so, and these tracks, by the way, have been sitting here for over an hour, you'll notice that the paint thinner starts turning this blackish coloring. What you're seeing here is the oil washing away. Now, hopefully this comes out on camera, but if you notice on the bottom of the bucket here, there are quite a few little black and silver specks. These are little shards and filings from the metal track links. These more likely are the little bits of metal that are pushed away from when the track links themselves are pinned together at the factory. They don't cause any problems, just they do wash away when you tend to give the tracks a paint thinner bath. Now from here, the tracks are all done. I'm going to take them out and let them thoroughly dry and aerate. Once that's all completed and the tracks are bone dry, they're going to head directly into paint. Now, one final thing I want to add is that this again seems to be a feature found exclusively on the Tegan tracks. From the other aftermarket tracks that I've worked on in the past, such as Matto, for instance, or even some of the Henlong tracks, they don't seem to have this oil residue type feature. However, if this isn't set in stone, and if you do encounter one of these aftermarket tracks, just give it a nice little feel. You'll instantly be able to tell if it has an oily residue or not. If it doesn't, you're good to go. If it does, perhaps you might want to consider giving it the bath that I just mentioned. Now that basically wraps this up. No it doesn't. There's one more thing I want to touch upon, and that has to do with this little corner that we have here. And this is basically the cherry on this sundae. And that has to involve this little parts bag. What could it be? Well, if anyone knows the mid-production Tiger, you'll know that the mid-production Tiger was very unique because there was a little bit of equipment found in this section here for the main gun, and that is the travel lock. Now this here is actually a brand new piece to the EastCoastArmory.com product line. And if I could get into focus, you could see what it looks like. This is a 3D printed component, and notice it is all comprised of one printing. So basically, it's ready for installation directly out of the box. This will work on any 1/16 scale Tiger. I almost had a slip there. This will work on the Tamiya, Henlong, and the Tegan, and probably even the Matto as well. If it's 1/16 and it's a Tiger, this will fit on it. This basically goes into this little section right over here and completes the look of this component. Now this piece here is non-functional, but it does have all of its chain work rendered in. It's really difficult to get on screen before it's pre-painted, so definitely in part 2 you'll get to see how this guy pans out once he's got his coat of paint on. But this is a nice, exciting addition to the 1/16 scale ECA product line because this is one little bit of equipment that has been lacking in this field, and it's really the cherry on top for your mid-production Tiger 1. Well, outside of a few small little tweaks that need to be made here or there, this guy here is predominantly ready for painting. So with that, that wraps up this part 1 of 3 video set for this 1/16 scale radio-controlled Tamiya mid-production Tiger 1. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small scale model showcase videos or even part 2 and 3 of this video set when they get released. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been posted on the channel in the past. Finally, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Till the next one. See ya.